They tell you to prepare when your husband goes to war, but no one tells you how to prepare for the version of him that comes back. When he left, I was a wife waiting for her soldier. I cried at the airport. I sent letters. I counted days on the calendar. I prayed for him every night. I imagined our reunion would be like the movies, running into each other's arms, tears, kisses, promises to never be apart again. But when he finally came home, it wasn't like that. Yes, he hugged me. Yes, he said he loved me. But his eyes, they were different. They were always somewhere else, like a part of him never got on the plane back. I told myself it was normal. That time would heal him. That my love would heal him. But instead, things only got darker. And soon he began to look at me not as his wife, but as a stranger, sometimes even an enemy. This is my story. The day he came home, I dressed in his favorite dress. A pale blue one, he once said, made my eyes look like summer skies. I wore the perfume he bought me years ago, though the bottle was nearly empty. I wanted him to feel like nothing had changed, like the life he left behind was waiting for him, perfectly preserved. At the airport, I spotted him among the soldiers, walking stiffly with that heavy green bag over his shoulder. My heart leapt, but something inside me paused. His shoulders looked broader, his face sharper, his eyes, not the soft brown I remembered, but hard, unreadable. He hugged me, but it felt like he was holding back. The warmth was there, but not the safety. I brushed it off. War changes people, I told myself. It would take time. That night, when we got home, he barely spoke. He just sat on the couch, staring at the wall. I tried to talk about dinner, about how quiet the house felt without him, but he only nodded. Later, when I reached for him in bed, he flinched, like my touch startled him. I lay awake for hours, listening to his uneven breathing. He twitched in his sleep, muttering things I couldn't understand. I reached for his hand in the dark, but he pulled it away. That was the first night I realized my husband hadn't truly come home. Days turned into weeks. He tried, I think. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he laughed at my silly attempts to cheer him up. But more often than not, he was distant. His phone became his comfort. He scrolled endlessly late at night. He drank more. At first, just a beer with dinner, then two. Then, the bottles started collecting in the recycling bin faster than I could hide them. I told myself he needed space, that he was coping in his own way. But, at night, I heard him get up. Quiet footsteps creaked on the stairs. He would sit downstairs for hours. Sometimes I heard him talking, but when I leaned down the hallway, there was no one, just him, sitting in the dark, whispering. I asked once who he was talking to. His face turned cold. No one, he said, but I knew. There was a scent sometimes, not mine. A perfume, faint, lingering. I searched the house, even sniffed my own clothes to make sure I wasn't imagining it, but it was real. Someone else's scent. That was when the suspicion began to creep in. The fights started small. "Why are you always awake at 3 a.m.?" I asked. He snapped, "Why are you spying on me?" I told him about the perfume smell. He accused me of losing my mind. I tried to hold him, to remind him I was here, but he pushed me away more and more. One night he shouted, "Stop looking at me like I'm a stranger." But he was the one who had turned into someone I didn't know. The house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like a stage where I was playing a role, the loyal wife, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was terrified, because sometimes, when he looked at me, I saw suspicion in his eyes too. like he thought I was the one sneaking around. And then came the night he stumbled home drunk, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled. His words slurred, his eyes bloodshot. "Who's been here, huh? Who are you seeing while I'm asleep?" I froze. My hands shook. No one. Only you. But he didn't believe me. That was the night I realized we weren't just fighting his demons from the war. We were fighting each other. Nights became the hardest. He barely slept. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of footsteps again, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking circles in our living room. Once, I crept halfway down the stairs and saw him sitting in the dark, staring at the front door as if waiting for someone. I wanted to speak, but his face scared me. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was hollow, like a man waiting for a ghost. Other nights, he shook me awake. His hands gripped my shoulders too tightly. "Who were you talking to downstairs?" he demanded. My voice trembled. I was asleep. I didn't go anywhere. But he didn't believe me. His eyes searched my face for lies that weren't there. I started locking myself in the bathroom just to breathe. Sometimes I cried quietly into a towel so he wouldn't hear. I loved him. God, I loved him. But I was afraid of the man the war had left behind. The drinking grew worse. Beers weren't enough. Whiskey bottles appeared, then stronger things. One night, I smelled something sharp, chemical. He was sitting by the window, smoke curling around him. His hands shook, his eyes glazed, pupils too wide. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. "Like what?" "Like, you know something I don't." I didn't argue, I just backed away, but inside, I was breaking. I begged him to see someone, a doctor, a therapist, anyone. But he laughed bitterly. "You want me locked up? You want me drugged until I forget who I am?" It wasn't him talking. It was the war. It was the silence. It was the poison he poured into himself. But every time he raised that glass, every time the smoke filled the room, I felt the distance growing. And I feared one day I wouldn't recognize him at all. The arguments turned violent, not with his fists, never that, but with words sharp enough to cut skin. "Maybe I should have died over there," he snapped once, slamming his hand against the wall. "At least then you'd be free to be with whoever you're sneaking around with." I screamed back, tears blinding me. "I've been waiting for you. I've loved you through everything, and this is what you think of me?" He stared at me, chest heaving. Then his eyes softened for a second, as if he saw the real me again. But just as quickly, the suspicion returned. The cycle repeated. Silence. Then shouting. Then apologies whispered through clenched teeth. I began to wonder if love was enough. Then came the day I found out I was pregnant. The little stick in my hand trembled as much as I did. A baby. A chance for new life, new hope. Maybe this was what would save us. Maybe this was the anchor he needed to stop drifting into darkness. But when I told him, he didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stared at me with that haunted look. "Whose is it?" he whispered. The words crushed me. I begged. I swore. I cried that it was his. That it had always been his. But he shook his head, muttering about scents, about footsteps, about voices in the night. And in that moment, I realized nothing I said could break through the prison of his mind. It happened so suddenly, yet I'd seen it coming for months. He stumbled through the house, drunk, screaming, accusing, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed his keys, muttering he needed to catch him in the act. I tried to stop him, begged him not to drive. I held his arm, but he pushed past me, his eyes wild and desperate. Headlights cut through the darkness as he sped away. I stood on the porch, my stomach heavy with our child, my heart shattering. That was the last time I saw him as the man I knew. Hours later, the phone rang. A voice on the other end said there had been an accident. And just like that, my world stopped. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. It isn't peaceful. It hums, heavy and constant, broken only by the distant beep of machines and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. That's where I lived for nearly a year and a half. He was alive, but not awake. The coma wrapped him like a shroud, keeping his body here, but his soul somewhere else. Every morning I came, swollen belly turning into a crying infant in my arms. Every night I left, whispering into his ear, begging him to fight his way back to us. I hated him for leaving me that night. I hated the choices that brought us here. But when I looked at his face, pale and still, I only felt one thing: love. People told me to move on, to accept the worst. But how could I? I had his son now, our son. And every time I looked into those eyes, I knew. This child was proof of everything that was real, not imagined. Motherhood was not what I had imagined. Every cry, every sleepless night, I carried alone. Some days I resented him for not being there. Not dead, not alive, just gone. A husband-shaped hole in my life. At first, I couldn't shake the whispers of his accusations. What if he never believed me? What if he woke up and looked at our child with suspicion instead of love? I spoke to psychologists, not just for myself, but for him. They explained what combat can do, how paranoia isn't always a lack of trust, but a symptom of trauma too deep to name. Slowly, I learned not to take his words as truth, but as the voice of wounds he carried home from war. Still, I waited, rocking our son to sleep, whispering stories about the father he hadn't met yet. Stories of bravery, of love, of the man I prayed would come back to us. The day he opened his eyes, the world tilted. I was sitting by his bed, our boy barely walking, now resting against my lap. Suddenly his hand twitched, his lips parted, and then, slowly, he looked at me. It wasn't joy at first. It was confusion, fear. He whispered my name like it was something fragile. Doctors rushed in, voices buzzing, lights flashing. I could barely breathe. When I came back hours later, he was more awake, and when he saw the child toddling beside me, his face crumpled. "Yours?" he asked, voice hoarse. I nodded, tears spilling. "Ours." But I saw it, the shadow of doubt returning, clinging like it always had. The doctors had been expecting this. They handed him an envelope before I could even speak. Inside, DNA results. His son, 100%. Undeniable. He stared at the paper for a long time. His hands shook. His lips moved, whispering things only he could hear. Finally, his eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time in years, I saw him. Really saw him. The man I'd fallen in love with before the war. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he reached for the boy. Our son toddled forward, laughing, unafraid. In that moment, something broke free inside him. The paranoia, the ghosts, the chains of suspicion. They didn't vanish, but they loosened. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe we could start over. When he came home from the hospital, everything felt wrong. He walked through the door like a visitor, not a husband. He stared at the walls, at the furniture, at the family photos I had placed to fill the silence of his absence. His eyes lingered on the picture of me holding our son in the hospital, tears in my hair, the exhaustion plain on my face. He didn't smile. He just looked. Haunted. I cooked dinner. He barely touched it. I asked how he felt. He said nothing. I reached for his hand and he flinched like my touch burned him. The war had taken him once. The coma had taken him twice. And now I feared the paranoia would take him forever. But I refused to give up. Not when our son's laughter filled these rooms. Not when I had spent every night praying for this second chance. The nightmares started almost immediately. He woke drenched in sweat, screaming names I didn't know. Sometimes he shoved me away, convinced I wasn't me. Other times he stumbled into our son's room, just to stare at him like he was making sure he was real. Once in the dark, he whispered, "I still smell him, whoever he was. I know you said it was in my head, but the smell, it's still there." I didn't argue. Instead, I wrapped my arms around him and whispered, "It was never him. It was always you." He cried silently into my shoulder until dawn. At first, he didn't know how to hold our son. His hands trembled as if the child was made of glass. But children don't care about fragility. They demand. And soon, our boy was dragging him across the floor, placing toys in his hands, climbing into his lap. One night, I came downstairs to find him asleep on the couch, our son curled against his chest. For the first time in years, his face was peaceful. It was the boy who saved him, I think. Not me, not the doctors. Our child pulled him back into the world with every giggle, every tiny hand reaching out for love. Therapy helped, but it was writing that changed him. At first, just scraps. Sentences scribbled on napkins, journal entries he refused to let me read. Then slowly, chapters. Stories about the war, about the ghosts he carried, about the paranoia that nearly destroyed him. One night, he handed me a notebook. His eyes were steady for the first time. "Read it," he said. I did, and I cried. Because for the first time, I understood the battlefield he had been trapped in long after leaving Iraq. A battlefield inside his own mind. That was the night I stopped fearing him. It came suddenly. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, while our son chased fireflies in the yard. He turned to me, voice low. "I'm sorry for everything I said, for everything I accused you of. I should have trusted you. I should have trusted us." I reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "You were broken," I whispered. "But you're here now, and that's all that matters." His shoulders shook. Not with anger this time, but with release. Healing isn't straight. It bends. It breaks. There were nights when he drank too much. Days when the paranoia whispered again, telling him lies. I caught him once searching through my phone, ashamed and desperate. But instead of yelling, I took his face in my hands and said, "Then look at everything. And when you're done, remember I never left." He broke then. Not because he found something, but because he didn't. Children see truth adults forget. One evening, our son climbed into his father's lap, placed tiny hands on his cheeks, and said, "Daddy, don't be sad. You came back. You came back to me." I don't think I've ever seen him cry harder. That was the moment something shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was choosing to live. Years later, he stood on a stage at a small bookstore reading from his book. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. He spoke of war, of paranoia, of love nearly lost, of a son who became his anchor, of a wife who refused to let go. When he finished, He looked at me in the audience, his eyes no longer haunted, but clear. "This book," he said, voice breaking, "isn't about me. It's about her, the woman who held me when I couldn't stand, the woman who reminded me that love doesn't disappear in the dark. It waits. It waits until you're ready to see it again." The room erupted in applause, and as I held our son's hand, I finally allowed myself to believe the war was over for all of us.